Welcome and thank you for joining us for the first webinar co-organized jointly by the AGRO and Environmental Chemistry Divisions of the American Chemical Society. This webinar is part of the AGRO Launch and Learn webinar series sponsored by EAG Laboratories. My name is Dion Dionisiou, and I am a professor in the Environmental Engineering and Science program at the University of Cincinnati. I am serving as chair-elect of the ACS Division of Environmental Chemistry. I will be serving as moderator for today's webinar. This webinar focuses on one of the most critical topics in environmental and agricultural research, the water-energy-food nexus. We are pleased to have two excellent scientists presenting today, Dr. Brandi Schottel and Dr. Rabi Mohtar. Dr. Brandi Schottel is a science analyst and sustainability science expert at the National Science Foundation Division of Chemical Bioengineering, Environmental and Transport Systems. Professor Rabi Mohtar is a professor at Texas A&M University. His research addresses global resource challenges such as the development of the water-energy-food nexus framework, linking science to policy, characterization of the soil-water medium using thermodynamic modeling, efficacy of non-traditional water using physical-based methodologies, and applications for sustainable integrated water management. During their presentations, the speakers will explain their views on what the water-energy-food nexus is and why it is important. Dr. Schottel will present an overview of the history and national agenda of the water-energy-food nexus, while Dr. Mohtar will discuss ongoing activities in the nexus. Both speakers will present their views on how the nexus will impact the educational and research agenda. And now we welcome Dr. Schottel to begin her presentation.
Hi, thank you, Dion. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I am pleased to be here to be speaking to you all today about the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. Thank you again to the American Chemical Society for sponsoring this on this important topic. And of course, thank you to everyone who's logged in today to listen and participate in this webinar. The title, Opportunities for Research and Learning, as Dion mentioned, actually means very different things to different stakeholders in their research community. And I'm going to give a perspective from the federal side. Obviously, it's going to lean heavily towards NSF and our funding opportunities associated with the food, energy, water nexus as well. This is similar in some cases to other federal agencies, and other ways it's different. And I'll give you some insight into that, and also how we picked this topic and how we expect it to develop in the future throughout the federal government. So in order to give you some of this information, I need to give you a little bit of background on NSF so you understand its similarities and differences with other federal agencies. Up here on the left, I have a statement here that it's an independent agency created by Congress in 1950 to promote the progress of science. That word independent agency has some special meaning. A lot of agencies here in the federal government are actually under the purview of a department. NSF is not. So you can think of the Department of Agriculture, which I believe houses 17 different agencies. NSF is not part of any of that, okay, under any department. We are also what's called a non-mission agency, which means we don't have a congressionally mandated mission to dictate the direction of any of our research. So we're here for the sake of science and engineering, for curiosity's sake. And we also want to look at it at the basic level, the very first level. What were you thinking when you submitted? What interests you? Okay. However, you'll notice here I've got the bottom part of this statement underlined that says advance national health, prosperity, and welfare, and secure the national defense. This line here is actually one of the reasons that NSF has large initiatives, and we have more than one running at any one time. Okay, but this is what we're trying to address here. All right, I've got a few stats here. Our last approved budget was $7.5 billion. This was in 2016. We haven't had an approved budget since then. We're on a continuing resolution. And by the way, you'll hear me say the word fiscal year a lot. The government operates on a budgetary year that starts on October 1, We're currently in fiscal year 17, which will end on September 30th of this year. Fiscal year 18 starts on October 1, 2017. We're pretty proud of the fact that we fund approximately 24% of all federally supported basic research conducted by the United States colleges and universities, and we are a major source of federal research support in multiple fields of science and engineering. So I wanted to bring up that non-mission status as well as give you some ideas on our limitations on things that we can give out. Like every federal agency, we're actually confined by the mechanisms that we are allowed to give money out for different research proposals, okay? So I've got the bulk of them listed here. I've got a few that are missing, like large research centers and so forth. What I wanted to do was list the ones that we're using with our Food, Energy, Water Nexus initiative called INFUSE, the Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Energy, Water Systems. And I need to highlight the most important one for the entire foundation, and that's this unsolicited. All right, what this means is basically we can't tell you what research we think is important. You tell us, okay? We have all these different programs that fall under major science and engineering categories, but I can't come out and say for the bulk of the research that we support, I think wastewater treatment is important. I want to fund that. It doesn't matter if no one submits a proposal on that, okay? I can't tell you to do so. Furthermore, you give us even a better idea of what you think is important through the merit review process of all these submitted proposals, okay? These go through external review. Many of you have sat on panels, and you've been through this process, okay? So you tell us twice what you think is important. We don't, and that's part of being a non-mission agency. The bulk of these here are all unsolicited. Sometimes we have what's called a Dear Colleague letter, and that's why I have it highlighted to indicate that we are interested in specific topics for some programs or for some workshops, but we do not require it as the only focus that you submit, okay? And we've used that in a lot of these up here. Many of you have gone to workshops and conferences funded by NSF. We have these research trainership grants that come out of the Education and Human Resources Directorate, and these are large centers at a university to help develop a new interdisciplinary topic, degree plan, or maybe some kind of certificate. We have these EAGRs, early concept grants, that sometimes go out in a DCL as well, where we're looking at topics that there's not a lot of data on. And this one here, which won't apply to everyone, the EPSCoR program here is actually specific to certain states and regions in the United States, and the list changes every year. It's based on a mandate that we're required to give a certain percentage of funding set aside for states that don't get a lot of our funding, since we are a national science foundation. And so there's some, we actually use the Research Infrastructure Improvement Program and emphasis there as well with INFUSE. And finally, we have this thing at the bottom, the special solicitations. You don't see a lot of these at NSF. And when you do, they are a little bit more prescribed. We have a couple things that we want you to cover, but even then, we're not very specific. It's still falling in line with our mission agency or lack of a mission agency status. All right, so how do we get to INFUSE? The best way to describe it is to look at a previous initiative and understand how they evolve. So before fiscal year 15, many of you will remember the Science and Engineering for Sustainability Initiative, SEAS. This had multiple solicitations, DCLs under it, that was designed to support interdisciplinary research and education that can facilitate the move towards global sustainability. This was identified as a topic that was at the border of multiple disciplines and wasn't necessarily mainstream. And the idea behind these large initiatives is to basically turn the collective heads of the entire scientific community and get them to look at it together, okay? And we want to make it mainstream. We want more people to be entering the workforce in this area. So there's always a workforce training component to these. I want to draw your attention to this line in purple. There was a special solicitation under SEAS called Water, Sustainability, and Climate, or WSC, which was co-sponsored with the United States Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, one of their agencies, their extramural funding agency. The data coming out of that as this was winding down was staggering. Okay, these projects were funded to study water systems to enable a new interdisciplinary paradigm in water research. So they were looking at understanding and predicting interactions between water systems and land use changes, the built environment, ecosystem functions and services, climate change and variability, and they're looking at different places and using different models. And what it really was telling us at the end, a lot of these awards, is that a new emerging so-called wicked problem was developing. And there's actually a definition of that term. I won't give you the long form of it, but they are considered cultural problems, and they are usually interconnected problems with other problems. So there's really bad feedback loops in it. They're very nebulous. They're not site-specific. And on top of that, they are all human caused, okay, because wicked problems are associated not with nature, but with social interaction or a cultural problem. So we were looking at this, and it was indicating that we had these three systems or infrastructure systems in the U.S. and around the globe of food, energy, and water that were highly dependent upon each other, but yet traditionally we have optimized them in isolation of each other. So we created our own wicked problem, okay? So when this was happening, we knew SEAS was going to end. Nothing at NSF lasts forever. We always are evolving to the new topic. We had to find data to support this, and we were by no means the only people who saw this. In fact, I believe USDA identified it before us. Other agencies noticed it. Other researchers were seeing it in their data, and it was actually quite alarming. So we had to gather a lot of information to basically sell this initiative across the foundation because everybody had to be on board, and then, of course, put it into our budget. Okay, so we had to convince Congress, and we had to convince the executive office as well. And so we go through all kinds of papers and reports. At one point, I think I had 60 of them stacked on my desk, and I wasn't the only one. And I'm just giving you two examples to see just how varying these reports were. The first one, the Worldwide Threat Assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, that's actually a public document that's put out every year. I'm citing the January 2014 version because this is what we used in some of our writing. That highlights food security, energy security, and water security as major security threats to the future in the United States. Also down here is a Department of Energy document called the Water-Energy Nexus Challenges and Opportunities. It's a report that they put out to examine this more from the water energy side. However, they approach it from the water energy land use view. Part of this is because they are a mission agency, and so studying food systems may not fall in line with their congressionally mandated mission. However, they are approaching it from their own angle because they do understand the importance of this wicked problem. So we're looking at this, and anytime NSF is looking at an initiative, we don't just do one thing with it, okay? We want to do multiple things. And right now, some of you have probably seen this. We have these 10 big ideas that NSF recently put out. Some of them are science ideas and research ideas. Others are what we call process ideas. Every agency goes through this, I don't know, every 5 or 10 years, where we try to predict what's coming down the pipeline that will need to be addressed based upon where society is going, okay? And we try to predict what we're going to need to do to address those problems. The one I have listed up here is kind of a buzzword. It is a process big idea from NSF. It's called convergence. And it recognizes, of course, these large grand challenges, such as the food, energy, water nexus, will not be solved by one discipline alone. But when you look at convergence to discipline, or convergence to definition, you're like, that looks like interdisciplinary research. We're already doing that. That's not actually true. In fact, even sponsoring convergent research is rather difficult. And the best way to do this is to give you just a very simple example. For interdisciplinary work, I'm a chemist in the lab. I've got some kind of chemical sensor that I'm using to detect phosphorus at different concentrations in water. All right, I've got it up to a certain sensitivity, and now I need to adapt it, whether it's collecting a spectrum or however I'm detecting, and have it adapted to fit to a device, basically, that's easy to use so we can take it out into the field. I don't have the background to do that, so I need to call up an electrical engineer or possibly more engineers. and have them help me with it. I'm outsourcing that next step to another discipline. And that is excellent. We want that to happen all the time, but that is interdisciplinary. Convergence is the idea where we're looking at the food, energy, water nexus as a whole. We bring all these people into the room together. There's social scientists, there's agricultural engineers, engineers of all types, chemists, mathematicians, physicists, biologists, geologists, you name it, all across the board. And they sit down together to define the problem they want to look at. And then they design their approach together from the very beginning. That is convergent research. And Infuse plays very well into that. And NSF in particular is well positioned to foster it, as we can cover all types of science and engineering disciplines with our research grants because of our non-mission status. And again, talking about convergent research, it requires a very different methodological approach to teaching as well, because if you have students working on these large convergent projects, they're learning from the start how to integrate other disciplines as they use their strengths to move forward. So it's a different shift in how you approach a problem. It's not always the one that's needed, obviously. We need disciplinary research, but we also need this new approach for these large system problems. So why food, energy, water systems? We have lots of options, okay? There's a lot of pressing problems in the United States that are not being addressed and around the world. And there's a couple reasons. One, we wanted to involve out of one of our previously existing initiatives, as well as there are definite attractions to the food, energy, water systems, dynamic coupled system of systems. And just me saying that should tip you off. It sounds clumsy because we don't really know what it is. Okay, we know it's coming, we know it's a wicked problem, but you cannot define it, all right? Every time someone talks about it, you'll see a diagram like this on the screen where it's, you know, food, energy, and water in some kind of triangle fashion. They're separate, but there's arrows pointing into them, suggesting feedback loops with each other. You've got these outside pressure points, such as food security. There's policies in place. We've got land use change, population change. People are moving around across the country, changing what they're doing with the land at different points, okay? So there's all these pressures on this interrelated system. However, again, we don't really have a definition when you look at this. And there's a couple floating out there, but no one fits every situation. My favorite one is the first one up here at the top. I'm a chemist, so this really speaks to me. To me, it's dealing with the interconnected water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles and how they are in equilibrium in most ecosystems. The food, energy, water nexus is a human problem. We've disrupted it with our intervention to the point where we're pushing it out of equilibrium and it's unable to recover in many instances. Often this has to do with our wastefulness and how we do things. And that wastefulness is usually driven by the fact that we're optimizing one of these systems by itself. Okay, and I'll give you one example. I work in wastewater treatment a lot. Right now, 1% of the U.S. energy is used just to treat wastewater in the United States. And we've optimized these processes to get it done quickly and cheaply, economically for the consumer, and to do everything we need to do just to get it out to EPA specifications. Unfortunately, buried in that wastewater is 5 times the amount of energy actually needed to treat it. And we're not recovering that. And that's in the source of all kinds of resources. You know, you've got things to be converted to methane through digestion. You've got your nitrogen and your phosphorus that you're not recovering. You're only treating away into a form that's not damaging. You've got latent heat. Okay, so there's all kinds of things buried in there, and we've optimized it to ignore those. All right, so this is just one example. Now, if that's too scientific for a lot of people or too chemistry related, the UN has put out one that's somewhat similar, and they say it's about balancing different resource user goals and interests while maintaining the integrity of the ecosystems that provide all of those resources. And finally, on this page, this is the big kicker here with our initiatives. Nowhere in any of the NSF calls associated with Infuse will you find a definition of the food, energy, water nexus, and that is actually done on purpose because we want you to define it with your research. So we did go ahead and request this for fiscal year 16, and I left this up because you can see some of the other initiatives that we had going on at that time. We requested $75 million, and then we waited. All right. So while we were waiting, at the end of C's, we had some money left over, and we wanted to not only prepare you, the community, but also get some feedback from you on what we think this should look like. So we put out a Dear Colleague letter with this money asking for submissions of workshop proposals on these topics, as well as supplements to existing research proposals already ongoing. The only stipulation for the workshop is that it had to be food, energy, water, and you had to have multiple disciplines attend. And then, of course, for the supplements, the research you already had usually needed to be in 2 of the systems, and the supplement was to add the 3rd. Okay, and then, of course, we also had a smaller addition from the mathematical and physical sciences where they asked for those early concept grants on some bottleneck areas of research. If any of you want a link to this report, I can send it to you afterwards. Please email me. It's an excellent one. So another way we approach this as we're waiting for our budget to fully come in at the beginning of 16 is we put out another DCL associated just with our unsolicited programs. And only 2 divisions participated in this the first year, and that's my division, CBET, and also the Division of Chemistry. And this one was associated with nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. And as you can see at the bottom here, there's a line taken directly out of that, and that the availability of these 3 resources are the 3 main factors that limit our ability to produce enough food to feed the growing population of the planet. Here you can actually see a list of the awards. They range from dealing with even catalysis of ammonia and different ways that we can make that more efficient, or also sometimes recycle the ammonia as it comes out. And it varied across chemistry and the engineering directorate. You'll notice we gave out 9 awards. 2 of them are the same, though. They're a collaborative, so it was actually 8 different projects. And that came to approximately $3 million. Also that year, once our budget was approved, we had the money for the special solicitation. And this is where we got prescriptive. But even then, it wasn't terribly so. We actually had 2 major requirements. One is that you had to be studying all 3 systems at once, okay? You couldn't just say, okay, I'm working on this energy efficient water treatment process, and that's going to lower the cost of clean water in the future, and therefore it's going to benefit agriculture. So the agriculture component became a broader impact, okay, rather than research happening within the project. And so that was not fit to program. You had to be doing all 3, which was not easy. The second major requirement was that the research proposed had to have a component that would fit into at least 3 different NSF science and engineering directorates, okay? Or 2 of those and an interest at USDA NIFA, at least 3 total. So, and by the way, I should have the USDA logo on the slide because they contributed a lot of money to this as well. That's a neglect on my part. We split it down into 4 major goals, and they naturally split into different tracks. However, if you look up some of the awards we gave the first year, you're going to find that many of them have components of all 4 tracks. I make this even simpler than the writing you see up here. If you look at the highlighted words, I call them modeling, decision support, solutions, and education. Obviously, you have these 3 different systems. There's a lot of modeling implications for this. You've got to combine the models from these. You have to be able to transfer them to different jurisdictions. Can you scale them up, scale them down, et cetera, and deal with the relevant cyber infrastructure support. The second one actually falls out of that, decision support. Can you use these tools to help those people who have to make decisions in order to integrate food, energy, and water infrastructure in the future? The third one, and I have this bolded only because I'm in the engineering directorate. This was track 3, the solutions one, and it was primarily led by engineers and also social scientists, because solutions also were social solutions or political solutions in many cases under study. And then finally, the last one, education and workforce training and professional development, because you can't build a field without people who know how to work in it, okay? So at the end of fiscal year 16, we ended up overall under the umbrella of INFUSE spending $72 million. Congress actually only approved for our special solicitation $35 million, and USDA added $5 million to it, so that was $40. But through the purview of some of these other programs that we have where we ask for emphasis areas, we ended up giving those Track 2 EPSCoR awards. Those are research infrastructure awards in EPSCoR states, as well as 3 NRT, those are those research trainership awards for curriculum development and interdisciplinary research development. We had our Infuse solicitation, that last slide that I just mentioned. It had 17 awards given out, and those were anywhere from $1 million to $3 million apiece. And then also unique to that year, our Community College Innovation Challenge, which was prize money, actually was on food, energy, water. So we came very close to our $75 million goal. So, and we do have a press release for that, and I'll tell you where to find that here in a moment as well. So what's up next? 17, and since we're almost done with 17, I have 18. This year we did just close the next Infuse large solicitation. It's only 3 tracks now because we expected the education and workforce training to be embedded in every single proposal. We eliminated that 4th track. We did do our NP H2O DCL again, but we added the Division of Materials Research to it. The NRTs are currently undergoing review in their large call, and there was a suggestion that food, energy, water is a preferred topic. We're continuing funding workshops, which Rabia will talk a little bit about on these topics. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this last piece here. Last month, we hosted our first Infuse Principal Investigators Workshop. Usually with large solicitations, we pull them in every year as part of the solicitation management plan. This year, we pulled not only those people, but we also pulled the NRT winners, the EPSCoR winners, let's see here, the DCL winners, and then on top of that, we invited those 27 supplement winners from the year before. The reasoning for this, and this is a final goal of a lot of these initiatives, is that we understand these are interdisciplinary, and there is no one single society that everyone working in it belongs to, because it's new. And so we're trying to foster community associated with these topics. And so that's where we're going with this initiative in the end, as it blossoms into its full community. So I'm going to stop there and turn this over to Rabia. Thank you again to ACS for hosting this, and also I have the sponsors of Infuse up here, us and USDA NIFA. And finally, if you're looking for some of the information I brought to you today, NSF sponsors this WordPress site that has a lot of the award information on it at foodenergywater.wordpress.com. And if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to help. And thank you.
I will be putting in a Nexus definition, building on what Brandi has mentioned, and I would like to highlight few of the confusion about what's new in the Nexus, describe some of the local, national, international drivers for the Nexus, some of those building on what Brandi has mentioned, and I'll give some examples both on the domestic front and in the international front. I'll put in some highlights of some of the challenges for research and education that the Nexus community is facing, introduce the Nexus community of science discussion and dialogue, and some concluding remark. I'll start with an outlook that achieving water and food security, harmonizing human and nature, and the feasible implementation mechanism for some of these Nexus solutions requires a holistic and system-level platform. I'm not going to go in detail of the platform of the Water-Energy-Food Nexus. It was excellent discussion and presentation by Brandi. I'd like to highlight in the middle here, there are 3 elements that are still the community is struggling with. One is developing a platform for understanding and quantifying the interlinkages, and for developing a platform for trade-offs. And I'll talk about trade-offs in more detail later. Last but not least, because of the limited resources and time, we need a platform to allow us to zoom in into hotspots and interventions, and how we choose those interventions and hotspots is a critical issue moving forward. So in addition to what you've heard about earlier about what is the Nexus, I'd like to pinpoint the stakeholders that are involved in this new field of science, starting with the governments in terms of the politics and the political economy, and looking at the business and the supply chain that governs a lot of the supply chain, especially for food, water and energy resources, look into the stakeholders in a vertical and inclusive, vertical and horizontal fashion. Last but not least is a society that that really is the demand for these primary resources. So what's new in the Nexus platform is that earlier we were looking at water productivity. The agricultural production community is familiar with water productivity discussion, and more recently that term has been used in the energy sector and looking at energy productivity. If you look at the water community, the community has been very effective in looking at integrated water resources management, and the energy efficiency has also been a driving force in many of the energy sector reform and research. If you look at the Nexus, it's neither one of those, it's all of the above. It's sitting at an equal distance from all of these disciplines and building on these disciplines and trying to build what we know today and build on that as a system of systems. And I'd like to also give a little bit more description of what do we mean. If we have an intervention pathways, if we have levers, what we call them, whether they're policy, whether technology, whether there's consumer behavior or societal, we need a platform that allow us to really quantify, understand these interlinkages, develop tools, develop the decision-making tools, develop the models, and allow us also to do a trade-off analysis as far as outcomes. So we're looking at each of these levers will allow us to look at water footprint, energy footprint, financial, carbon footprint, and land requirement. All of these need to be ranked by a stakeholder dialogue, by stakeholder preferences. And again, the stakeholders in this case could be a policymaker, could be an industry, could be a scientist, could be a concerned citizen and civil society, and develop what we look at sustainability index. And the sustainability here carries the social, economic, environmental indicators. But unless we have that platform that allow us to debate and dialogue and move forward, we will not be able to make an impact to why we actually started that discussion about the Nexus. So I would look at the Nexus as a framework that interactually defines the problem, goes through the analytics, define a trade-off analysis protocol, and allows the user a feedback into this process and allows for sustainable evaluation for these levers and a dialogue so that we can actually make an impact. So it's a full life cycle analysis of these solutions. There are several Nexus solutions and I would like to categorize them into thematic. Those are focused on water, energy, and food security, and many examples that I'll share later. Geographic, both in the US, Middle East, North Africa, Africa, and Asia. Several examples have been published out there, and I'd like to stop at the global with the Sustainable Development Goals, giving really rise to new drivers in this area. So at this stage, I'd like us to look at what are the global, national, and local drivers that really drive the Nexus, both in terms of the demand for these tools and knowledge, but also in terms of the gaps that are missing in our understanding. So the first driver, as in fact highlighted in some of the what Brandi has mentioned, is the primary resources gap. So depending on what literature you look at, we're looking at most literature says that, okay, we need to double our food supply. Now we could debate this, food waste is a big issue, but that's not the point. So we do have a food gap because of population growth, also because of the climate change moving forward. We also have a water gap. Many of the literature is zooming down into business as usual, there will be a 40% water gap. And we all know that there's an energy gap moving forward, 60–70% energy gap. So there is a primary resources gap, and the buffer that we had earlier is no longer exists, so we need to be careful moving forward. Not only the gap is important, but also the interconnectedness of these primary resources. So we know that the bulk of our water, depending where you are, between 70 and 80% of our water goes into food production. We've got 30-35% of our energy goes into the water production and distribution. So all of this interconnected system of systems makes it even more complex. The other driver is the inequity of distribution. So if you look at, for example, global water maps, global food insecurity maps, global energy insecurity, there's a lot of disparity. But even if you look at the local and the national level, there are inequity in the distribution that actually prevents us from reaching our targets moving forward. I'd like also to pinpoint one of the drivers is the climate change and the Paris Agreement. Some of you may have been involved in that process, but the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll mention later, are drivers. So in the climate change, we have, or at least some, the subtropics will have less water in terms of rivers and reduced soil moisture. The implication of that is the reduced water recharge, the reduced freshwater supply. So we already have a water shortage. We will have increased water shortage, but also we'll have, because of the less moisture, and 2/3 of our food production is coming from dryland farming, we will have stresses on the additional stresses from climate change on food production. Some areas rely heavily on hydropower. There will be a problem as we see it in the hydropower. We also have an increase in energy to maintain our buildings, to maintain the air conditioning due to the temperature rise. So all of that would constitute additional driver for the Nexus. And I'd like to stop at number 5, which Brandi mentioned earlier, in terms of the security community and looking at the assessment of what are the risks. And there's a global trend over the last, if you look at the World Economic Forum report for the last 6-7 years, and actually even more for the last 8 years, there is a trend in how the global community is perceiving risks. So in addition to the geopolitical risk, in addition to the other securities, there are emerging trends in terms of water security, food security, and energy security are becoming on the top risk, topping the chart in terms of what the global leaders, thought leaders, are looking at that. And all of these 6, and with the Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned earlier, all of these 6 elements constitute a global drive for us moving forward in the Nexus debate and Nexus discussion. I'd like to shift into some of the scenarios and some of the examples, and I will start with the scenario-based tool for socioeconomic evaluation of the energy development in Texas Eagle Ford Shale. The objective of what I'm going to be sharing this research project is to evaluate the trade-offs between water, energy, and transportation. If you're familiar with how the shale gas production, it relies a lot on water trucks to remote areas in terms of moving in water and moving out wastewater from these production sites. And we're going to look at under different scenarios of oil and gas production. And the goal is to really develop, based on the science, based on the interrelationship of the water system, the energy system, and the transportation system, develop a planning tool to create a trade-off moving forward. So in a nutshell, that WET tool that we call it Water Energy Transportation Nexus tool, in a nutshell, it looks into various scenarios, inputs, that is oil price, natural gas price, and water use. Those are the drivers, and we have several scenarios that look into the projections based on various combination of the above, and we were looking at trade-off analysis. So the output of the tool is looking into the oil production, the gas production, the water footprint, the total revenue, the total risk in terms of road safety, and many other factors. We group those into sustainability index, looking at social, economic, and environmental. Now, the beauty of this tool is a platform that allows the beginning of the dialogue. It looks at what-if scenarios and the implications, and as we take this into application in actual real dialogue, the implication in the policy and regulations and tax subsidy reform, into looking at innovation technology. One of the critical things that we look at here, some of the solutions that out-of-the-box solution that may not have been feasible, when you look at this whole system of systems, they become feasible, and technology is one of those. If you look at the externalities and the additional costs, that the hidden costs in this whole system, you may look at a very expensive technology become feasible. Last but not least, consumer behavior. We could take this into further discussion if there is interest in the Q&A, but one of the governing structure that we look at here is that who pays for it and how do we develop the governing structure that allows this nexus solution to move forward is still a big challenge. Other examples in the Texas water gap. Texas is running a 40% water gap moving to 2070 based on the Texas Water Development Board report. And if I look at this map, in the north part of the panhandle, there's a lot of green dots. Those are wells for agriculture. So you're looking at water, food, nexus there. If you look at San Antonio, that's blue dots represent the water for municipalities. And if you look at the Eagle Ford, which is that strip in here with the red dot, this is the water extraction wells that will support the energy production. The point I'd like to, with this map, is that one of the lessons that we learned using the Nexus solution, that it is very much a spatially biased, temporally biased, so we cannot devise solutions that fit all at all times and all locations. And some of the outcomes of this study is to looking into, for example, in the Lubbock area where you've got a lot of agriculture, is to look into encouraging dryland farming as one of the emergence Nexus solutions. Also look into reclaiming water for water reuse, even though this is an expensive option, but if you look at the externalities, it may be a feasible solution, especially if you invest in renewable energy. If you look at more on the urban side, the low impact development, even though this is something expensive to install, but it could be an option for that area if you look at all of the other externalities. The Eagle Ford, again, we revisited here with a different lens, and we look at the net benefit, and also there's a greater cost on water security and impact on road and maintenance safety that needs to be looked at when we move forward with further energy exploration. Moving into the global scene and what some of the examples and the application of the Nexus in the Sustainable Development Goals, and a case study from Morocco, where what we wanted to do is to demonstrate how the Sustainable Development Goal 2, 6, and 7, which are the water, energy, and food respectively, how do they interact and how are they interconnected, and do we want to quantify these interconnections and then explore possible trade-off for implementing SDGs, because as I said earlier, there has to be a trade-off because you cannot do every single possible solution that you would like to. Some example of our analysis that we conducted, we looked at Morocco as a case study, and we look at the Green Morocco Plan, which is one of the agriculture plans for Morocco, and highlighted here some of the elements of that plan. We looked at the Morocco water strategy that focuses on desalination and treated wastewater investment, and also we looked at the Morocco energy strategy that invests increasing up to 42% of the renewable. What we have done in here in the middle, we've looked at all of these portfolio and look at all of the interlinkages that defines the interfaces of water, energy, and food portfolio. These calculations are very much local because and I'll give you an example. So the efficiency, for example, of a desalination plant would be different in California than if you put it in Al Jurf al-Asfar in Morocco, because of the temperature, because of the salinity, because of the turbidity, all of these impact the efficiency of the system, they impact the relationship that governs how much energy it takes to produce 1 cubic meter of water. The same thing with the energy production. It's very much local, dependent on the technology that you use, the efficiency of that conversions, and of course the food production is another example of how much local these relationships has to be. So based on the analyses, this highlight of the trade-off that we looked at, so for Morocco, where they are investing in water and land and energy at the expense of food security because they're reducing their investment in the cereal, even though they're increasing the olive and citrus production. However, there is a decrease of at least 20% in cereal production. In the energy space, even though you are gaining the emissions, and this initiative was actually rolled out in COP22 last year in Marrakesh, so there is a increased efficiency and increased in reducing the emission, but also increasing the energy security. Morocco imports a lot of its energy from outside, so by increasing the renewable up to 42%, you're gaining on the security. However, that is the trade-off is that there is a financial investment, and there's also a deliberate investment for land use to move from agriculture into solar panels in this case, and also reducing investment in the water. For the water security and the treated wastewater, the investment in water, and that also is a trade-off in the investment in the energy, as well as that investment would allow you to be more water secure. So the point here is that there are trade-offs, and then the government in Morocco needs to look at these trade-offs more seriously in terms of what are the priorities moving forward. If a kind of a summary conclusion from the case studies that the Nexus solution needs to be looked at a multi-stakeholder platform, and I mentioned multi-stakeholder. It has to be vertical and horizontal, allowing for different scales and also different types of the stakeholder to be involved. We need to account for spatial and temporal distribution, which is very, very important. The case, I highlighted that in the case for Texas. We need to account for all of the interconnectedness and the competition between these resources. Then at the end of this, there need to be a communication, a very clear communication of these trade-offs, so that there will be a societal engagement in these decisions moving forward. The big challenge again is that who pays for it? What are the government mechanisms that needs to be put in place to look at that? And last but not least, Nexus Solutions is a holistic but yet localized, that's the kind of the message take home. I'd like to, the next few minutes, highlight few of the challenges that we're facing in the Nexus community, starting with the modeling. We do realize that the modeling is a big challenge, so what type of modeling we're looking for down the road that captures all this connectedness, that captures the processes at multi-scale, what type of data we're looking for. In terms of the governance, as I mentioned, this is a huge challenge for the, especially for the solutions moving forward. The modeling and the technology solutions can move forward, but developing a policy coherence across the few Nexus sectors is very, very important. Questions such as financing and incentives for sectors to come together, discuss these solutions moving forward, even though it could be a win-win for the society. However, we are still operating in a disciplinary world where water is managed by the water sector, energy is managed by the water sector, and food is managed by its own sector. So how do we develop a coherence policy to allow for these people to come together and give them the incentive for coming together? Also, in the trade-off, we need to develop the tools and the analytical framework and that allow for these trade-offs to be clearly stated and evaluated to make impact in society. In the water energy space, there's a lot of technologies that need to be developed to reduce the dependency of the water energy and energy on water. So there is a huge room for innovation in this space that we still look for. In the agriculture, this is the big elephant in the room. As I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of our water goes into food production. So how do we develop a better out-of-the-box agriculture production system that optimizes the water and energy need? Not only water, but you need to look at a holistic system that optimizes the water energy for a sustainable agriculture production scenarios. Those could be rain-fed agriculture and the use of non-traditional water for food production and processing. This is a huge challenge for us. I'd like to close with a couple additional challenges, which is the role of the water and energy food Nexus community. What kind of questions that this community would be looking for, and I'd like to highlight a couple of those that may be relevant. Is the society is needed, and do we need a journal? What kind of an interaction with other societies that are needed, and how do we develop that mechanisms? I'd like to hear from the audience out there their views on the emerging need for a Nexus community of science. The next challenge that I'd like to leave us with is that how do we train the next generation of leaders in academia, industry, and government, and as well as civil society that are Nexus friendly? What type of programs are needed and what mechanisms are needed, and how do we facilitate such a transition? In there, you see a reference to a workshop that was conducted here, and several of the players debated the Nexus community of science, and they debated the education issues along with the research agenda for the Nexus community. Stay tuned for the report. That report is in the drafting mode, and it will be available from NSF website. Concluding remark, the Nexus platform built on the integrated water resources management, the water productivity, and the energy efficiency, it has the potential for achieving water, energy, food security. There's a need for quantification of approaches and modeling. One thing that I didn't mention explicitly, but implicitly, there is a need for valuing resources in terms of water, energy, and land for moving forward in a more sustainable global commons that are being threatened. This is very important. I can't emphasize it enough. I did highlight some research, education, and government challenges in the Nexus that needs to be looked at. Last but not least, I believe that the Nexus community of science may offer the Nexus community a platform moving forward. I'd like to hear from you, and especially on this one. I'd like to acknowledge the American Chemical Society, National Science Foundation, the Texas A&M Water-Energy-Food Nexus initiative for their support in a lot of these activities, and would be happy to hear from you. My email is listed there for further inquiries.